right, so I'm Chris Kirsten with the Savory Institute, and I'm just going to do a brief introduction of Allan here. Thank you so much, Matt. That was phenomenal. But Allan is a Zimbabwean. That's where he was born. He's been a game rancher, a ranger, a research biologist, and he's come across some amazing discoveries. I've been a rancher and a farmer for my entire life, and I just can't think of a greater visionary. I've been a fan of Allan's about 10 years. I pinch myself every day. I get to work with him now. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Allan Savory.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Pardon me while I just set that up. I think you saw that before. I'm going to take us to a whole different level. I'm going to take us down to utter simplicity. That was all too much for my little brain. Agriculture is at the root of a lot of problems. I'm not going to belabor you all with it. We've got a rising population, climate change, global desertification, poverty, violence, wars, all of these. I come at this from a very different angle from most people. Starting out as a researcher, I became disenchanted with academic life and being a researcher in an institution, and I became a private independent scientist and supported myself in any way I could. And then circumstances took me trying to support myself, game ranching, farming, ranching. I became an international consultant. I spent an unfortunate 20 years in war as a consequence of what we're talking about, poor land, poor people, etc., and had unique opportunities. Whatever hat I was wearing, I ended up being exiled. I was leader of the political party in opposition to the government in a civil war, not a popular thing to do. And whatever hat I was wearing on any given day, it didn't matter to me. It was all the same problem. It is all bound together. Now, agriculture is the root of what we're talking about. Without agriculture, you wouldn't be here. We cannot have an orchestra, a university, an army, anything. It is the basis of civilization. Nothing else is. Agriculture has ruined more than 20 civilizations that have failed, and it is now threatening us globally. Let's look at the position with agriculture. The global figure, and it's, in my view, hopelessly too low and inadequate, is that we're losing about 70 tons of destroyed, eroded soil for every human alive on the planet today. We need that's about 10 tons, sorry, not 70 for everything, that's about 10 tons per human. We need about half a ton of food to maintain a human in a healthy condition for a year. So we're going out of business. Now, not only is it doing that, it's leading to global desertification, the increasing frequency and severity of floods with no change in weather. It's leading to poverty, social breakdown, violence, emigration. You're reading about the ships turning over as immigrants try to get to Europe from desertified countries. We're going to fight worse wars over water than we ever did over oil. Already I'm dealing with that, where people are herding their cattle with AK rifles. And of course, it's contributing enormously to climate change. I don't believe any informed person could argue agriculture is causing climate change, not just fossil fuels. And probably just as much or more than fossil fuels, but what is most serious is even after we develop benign forms of energy, which we have to do and can only be done with technology, climate change will continue because of agriculture. It is the biggest single problem facing the world. And very few people are talking about it. Now, I'm going to go down to a very basic level to show why we've never understood this, a part of it. We are a tool-using animal, period. And of all the tool-using animals, we could use sticks and stones, and only two ever developed the ability to actually make a tool, not just use a stick or a stone, and those were crows and us. Now, as a tool using animal, we have enormous creativity. We have money and we have our labor. You cannot do anything with them without picking up a tool. So if I say to you, Matt, drink water but don't use technology, what would you do right now? You'd have to go to the nearest river and drink it with your mouth. You can't even drink water without technology. All right, so we've got technology. Now let's look at this technology of ours. About 1 million years ago, I'm not going to quibble about the times, we acquired sticks and stones. We could chip the stones and sharpen them, sticks, but we could not affect our environment in any way. Somewhere during the last 1 million years, we started to use fire, then we learned to light it, to make the tool. And when fire occurred, things began to change drastically because we could now melt the stones and go into the bronze, the copper, and the Iron Age. And so our technology developed from sticks and stones to space travel and everything in this room, including the clothes you're wearing. None of anything you see in this room could have been developed without fire. For most of human existence, 99.9%, we had two tools, technology and fire. That's it. Sometime after domestication of plants and animals, around about 10,000 years ago, we developed the idea of another tool. We could rest the land, positively rest the land as a tool. Probably from crop farmers moving their crops or pastoralists moving their livestock. The only other tool we have ever thought of is using small living organisms to make cheese and wine. I told you I was going to take you down to a really primitive level. You can train in any university in the world, including Harvard, okay, in any profession, and unknowingly you'll be trained to use technology. Occasionally fire, resting land, and now small living organisms that we can genetically engineer. That is it. Now, when we look at the agricultural problem, the thing that has caused the earliest agricultural civilizations to fail was all blamed on livestock. We know this, as I said in a recent TED talk, everybody knows this, from Nobel laureates to fishermen, golf caddies, whatever. I was taught it at university. I grew up knowing it, seeing the devastation in Africa caused by cattle, sheep, and goats. Well, it's not as simple as that. As I said in that TED talk, we were once equally certain that the world was flat. We were wrong then, and we're totally wrong again. Let me explain very simply why. We have environments which are perennially humid, like around here. And we have environments where it's humid in part of the year and then dry. And this is regardless of rainfall. The rainfall can be high or low in either one. It's the distribution of humidity that matters. When we look at what happened when we abandoned our cities and civilizations, as we've done many times, and are probably going to have to do again, when we look in the humid environments, total biodiversity recovered, no matter how bad the damage to the land, and we find our ruins under recovered land and vegetation. When we look in the other type of environment, we find once they were abandoned, the opposite happened. The deserts just took over, desert sands. And we didn't study this. Now, when we look at the second type of environment, fortunately with space stuff now, we can see the proportions, and roughly, I've circled in red, what is the seasonal rainfalls where the main desertification is occurring. And this is most of the world's land. That is our Achilles heel. Now, what is desertification? All it is a symptom of biodiversity loss. Without biodiversity loss, it doesn't occur. So it's not even a problem, it's a symptom. Now, it happens when we begin to lose biodiversity, not charismatic species, just litter and dead plant material covering soil, and the rainfall that is available becomes less effective. Now, that's not taught in any university in the world, and it's painfully simple. Let me show you what I mean. This is the Tehama Desert, okay? We're close to a research station, and an inch of rain was falling. You're seeing an inch of rainfall there. To get grip of that easily, think of it as drums of water, okay, each holding 45 gallons or 40 gallons or 200 liters. So over 1,200 drums of water fell on every hectare of that land. That's a hell of a lot of water. Okay, where did that water go? Because that's what that land looked like the next day. Where had that water gone? That's non-effective rainfall. That rain had run off, some of it. That's what gives us flash floods, surface flow. And what had soaked into the soil simply evaporated out again. I walk barefoot. I live barefoot nearly all the time. I tell you that the bare ground, I can walk on it. After about 2 o'clock in the day, I can't even walk to our headquarters barefoot. My feet are burning after more than 3 steps. You're not aware of it, you wear shoes. It's just sucking the water out of the ground. Now, to be effective, rainfall has to penetrate the soil and only leave it one of 2 ways: transpired through plants or flowing through the soil to permanent river flow, aquifers and springs. That is effective rainfall. Now, let's look at a grassland, because most of the area I showed you circled in red, whatever you call it, dry deciduous forests, savannas, whatever, is the stability of the land comes from grasses. These are what provide us the bulk of the ground cover. Now, here is a grassland, and it's just come through 4 months of rain, and you've got a mass of grass. Now, the rain stops. So watch that as it changes with the rain stopped. Now, all that grass material above ground, except for the crown of the plant, is dead. It's no more use to the plant. It'll never come alive again. Now, that has to decay biologically before the next rains. And if it doesn't, that soil, that grassland starts to die. All of that starts to die. Soil is a living thing. Soil is life. Without life, you don't have soil. You have stand, rocks, etc. All right, now, if it does not decay and we just leave it, it shifts to a chemical process of oxidation. If you come to my home, I live in a mud hut with a thatch roof. The outside of the roof is that dark color. It is oxidizing in sunlight. The inside of the roof is yellow still, and it will be 20 years from now because it's not in sunlight. So this is a process happening in sunlight, but it is so gradual, that's why I can roof my house with grass. It is so gradual that it blocks the sunlight, filters the sunlight, which should reach the growth points of the plants that are down at the ground, out of harm's way of animals, and the plants prematurely kill themselves, and we get bare ground, desertification, non-effective rainfall, or if the rain is higher, it shifts to woody vegetation. And we then call it native, non-native, noxious, and start pouring on the poisons. Okay, now traditionally, all my life and way before me, starting thousands of years ago, we have burnt to prevent that. But that is chemical oxidation that is rapid. It pollutes the environment and it leaves the soil bare for the rainfall to be non-effective. We justified that, leaving millions, more than 2 billion acres burns in Africa alone every year. We justified that because the grass is now able to flush because the sunlight can reach the growth points. Now, when I got to the United States, and we never could have discovered what I'm telling you tonight in any one country, any one institution, the clues were scattered around the world. When I got to the United States, I got a terrible shock to see national parks like this. This is a national park. That is desertification as bad as anything in Africa. And I didn't even find curiosity amongst scientists as to why is this happening in a national park. That's had no livestock, so there must be something here more than livestock causing this, which has become a scientifically valid truth, even though there's no science whatsoever to back it. But it's become a scientifically valid truth, as I say. I then began looking at experimental plots all over the western United States. They were put in many years ago when the government wanted to shoot 50,000 sheep of the Navajos. They needed data to back that policy, so experimental plots were put in. If you stop grazing the grass, it grows. The grass grew, they took the photographs, shot the sheep, but the desertification got worse. Thank God they left the plots. So I went finding these plots all over the western United States, and here is one. I took these pictures from a position paper on climate change of the International Range Society, and the caption, I shortened it slightly there for you, was that livestock were removed in the 50s, but processes resulting in the replacement of grass with shrubs continued. That had been green grassland, it had become desert, and the desert bushes have increased, and it's described as processes in a peer-reviewed paper. What processes? Nobody curious about it. Our beliefs were just so deep that rest couldn't be doing this. Now, if we're going to correct it, what can we do? Remember our limited tools. Is there any technology even imaginable that could restore biological decay to billions of tons of vegetation over billions of hectares, roughly 2/3 of the world's land, every single year in a compressed period of the year? I think we can forget that one. Now, that hasn't deterred us from trying to use technology. It started in this country with prestigious universities developing giant machines to try to lay the litter, get the vegetation on the ground, etc. Nobody questioned them because they came from prestigious experts. Nobody asked for the science. Millions of dollars were spent on that by this government, international agencies, governments in North Africa, and today the machines lie rusting. It didn't work. And this I took about a year ago in the Negev. Here, the Israeli government, brilliant people, are putting in earthworks that I marked with the dotted lines, and they're trying to harvest the runoff, the non-effective rainfall, to grow trees, and this is costing 10,000 euros per hectare. The Nabateans were doing it there more than 2,000 years ago. It didn't work 2,000 years ago, and it's not going to work now. And we have unintended consequences, so they're taking away the Bedouins' sheep, cultural genocide, and they're paying the men an allowance based on how many children they have. What do you think the men are doing? I had dinner with the mayor of one of the towns they're settling them in. The Bedouins put on a dinner for me, and the mayor said to me, "Allan, how old do you think my citizens are?" I said, "I haven't any idea, you tell me." 12 years old. He said, "I'm the mayor of a town where the average age is 12. All right, what had we missed? What we had missed was those are the environments where the soil, the vegetation, and all co-developed, not plants before animals, all developed together over millennia. And those are the environments where millions of herding animals with the microorganisms in their gut developed as one whole, indivisible whole with the land. And those animals were non-self-regulating populations. There are some that can regulate, but they don't herd. All of the herding ungulates are non-self-regulating populations. They breed and breed and breed. Their numbers are regulated by disease, accident, and predation. Now, they had enormous predation. Big prides of lions, hyenas, wild dogs, all the rest of it that we have in Africa. And when these animals are subjected to this level of pack hunting predators, the only real defense they have is to be very small, fleet, and not get into herds and try and escape, or to get into herds, and the bigger the herd, the safer they are, because the pack hunter will not attack the herd. They're afraid of the herd, and they have to try to get an animal out to kill it, and you've probably seen that on National Geographic films and so on. All right, so when they are herding in these big herds for protection, they're grazing animals. So they're herded, they're feeding on the ground, and they're dunging and urinating. no animal likes to feed on its own feces, including us. So what do? If you're dung and urinating all over the ground in high concentration, you have to keep moving. And it was that movement induced by the predation that prevented the overgrazing of plants. Now, that was discovered more than 60 years ago by a French scientist, published in 4 languages, never refuted, really solid work, that overgrazing, which all of our organizations, environmental, farming, universities, believe is due to too many animals, has got nothing to do with animal numbers. It's got everything to do with time, the time the animals are there and when they return. And consequently, the moving animals avoided that. Okay, so coming back to our tools now, I've taken the small living organisms off because we can't do anything with that. All right, so we've got our 3 tools. Technology, not a hope, to put this right, in the United States, where it's desperately serious, or any other country. Fire, not a hope. Resting land causes it. So what are we going to do? In developing the holistic framework that arose out of this, one of the things we do is make all decisions socially, environmentally, and economically sound, using all available science and sources of information, and then no matter how much the decision is supported by research, etc., we automatically assume it is wrong, because nature is complex beyond our comprehension. Now, having said that, now you'll realize it's very serious when somebody like me says, as I did on the TED Talk, we have no option. Climatologists, scientists, all of us have absolutely no option but to do the unthinkable, and that is to use livestock. To use animals to mimic animals, not machines to mimic animals. And that way we can begin to reverse global desertification and address climate change. And there is no other way, and I will stake my life on it, unless some scientists can come up with some tool that can restore biological decay technologically over 2/3 of the world every year. When I first realized this in the 1960s, I was faced with a terrible dilemma. How the hell were we going to do it? We'd had 10,000 years of extremely knowledgeable pastoralists. Their whole life and culture is their animals. They had bunched and moved their animals for all those thousands of years, and that made the great man-made deserts. So we couldn't do that. Then we'd had about 100 years of modern range science, rotational and other grazing systems, and that had accelerated the desertification. We first discovered that in Africa, and then when I got here, I confirmed it here. So modern range science, rotational grazing, all these things we couldn't use, we couldn't herd them. What could we do? At that point, being an independent scientist, I could go far and wide to any professions. I started looking desperately everywhere. Who had handled complexity, anything like this? We ecologists hadn't, biologists, none of us had. And I looked at all sorts of things, including Harvard, business, planning, etc., because I realized we need some way of dealing with a very complicated situation. Most of them were academic. They were too impractical. You had to go through a massive training to understand them, and I didn't think the people then did understand it. And looking around like that, I hit on the military, because armies of Europe for 300 years had, by one mistake after another, had to develop planning techniques for immediate battlefield conditions, where people under great stress, people could be trained rapidly in times of war, and they had developed planning techniques, just breaking the whole situation down into small digestible bits, and out of it, from your stressed head, came the best possible plan at that point in time. I could say, okay, we can do that, But armies have never had to deal in immediate battlefield conditions with months ahead or planning 2 years ahead, with animal behavior, with volumes of vegetation. How on earth can we handle that? And I thought, why not just put it on a chart? And so we developed holistic planned grazing. It's done on a chart. It has to be done on a chart to show all the dimensions. And it is so simple a child can learn it. I've taught school leavers in 1.5 hours to do it. And that worked. We started immediately to reverse desertification. And before we even let it loose on people, we took the worst land in the country, the worst land with no grass left, and we trebled the number of animals immediately and just grew grass. Just planning the movements of the animals to mimic nature, and back came the grass. Now it has spread to something like 40 million acres on 5 continents. The only continents we're not practicing it on are the Arctic and the Antarctic. And thank God for TED, 20 minutes talk overcame 50 years of academic argument. It is just common sense, and people are responding to that. All right, so when we come to the issues we're dealing with today, eating meat is a big issue with some people. Amount of methane cattle put off, whether or not grasslands store carbon. I don't want to belittle these issues, but they're academic issues. Let me assume something that's totally wrong. Let me assume that nobody eats meat. We decide not to eat meat at all. What are you going to do? Are you going to accept increasing droughts, floods, climate change, cultural genocide, wars over water? Let the damn meat rot. Let the jackals eat it. Let the hyenas eat it. You're still going to have to use livestock. You don't have an option. We've got to start getting real. Now, what about the methane? Let's assume for a moment that cattle put out 10, 20 times the methane that they do. What's your option? You still have no option. Fortunately, methane is broken down in healthy soils. But even if it didn't, you have no option. Now, let's assume for a minute that the grassland soils of the world could absorb absolutely none of the excess carbon. So what are you going to do? You still have no option to deal with climate change except to address desertification. Because even after fossil fuels, it's going to continue because of desertification. So I've gone through these 3, and yes, people can debate them, but every year we debate and argue about these is going to prove catastrophic for us. Because these things that are happening now are happening exponentially. And when we might spend another 2 or 3 years academically arguing in our environments here, while we are talking, thousands and thousands of men, women, and children are dying while we fiddle around arguing about these things, when we don't have an option but to act. Well, as I said, we're already doing it. I just put one picture up there. Some of you can look at the TED talk, and there are many other things, and I'll just sort of finish with this one. This is land where we're pressing the edge of the envelope. This is land we have in Zimbabwe. I've known the land for many years. It used to be nearly all bare ground, algae crusted, etc. We've got it, we increased the livestock 400%, planned the grazing, integrated them with the elephants, the giraffe, the buffalo, the lions, everything else. And this year, this picture was taken very recently, we've had the driest year any of us can remember for the last 15 years. Right? Now, because we've had the rainfall cumulatively each year becoming more effective, in this driest year of the last 15, we have grown more grass than we ever could in the best of years. And right now, we are trying to find the money and the cattle to double their numbers again, simply to keep pace with the production of the land. because we don't have enough animals, including all the wildlife, to get that grass down, covering the soil and decaying. So literally we're being forced to double again in what would have been a tragic year just to keep pace with the production of the land. Now start picturing that over the world, and it'll be a very different world. Thank you.
Hi, so we have some time for questions. Just a recap on how to use the mics. You'll notice that in front of you, some of you might be sharing some, there's like a black little cap thing, and then there'll be a little sign that says to push. Just push down, and then the light will turn green when the mic is on. And Erin, our president, will be moderating, so if you have questions, raise your hands, and she'll come by and tell you to speak up.
We've decided I will answer Matt's questions and he will answer mine.
Pushing it. Oh, clearly I don't go to law school. Thank you both so much. Matt, this question's actually for you. I was wondering if you could address the potential for political influence over such studies. I'm mostly thinking about how the USDA, FDA publishes statements such as eat less red meat and therefore influences potentially publications and those biases, and then that kind of links to those peer editors for those studies as well. I do epidemiology research, and I am equally as frustrated at the showing of some results and not all the results, and then that begs the question of what are the true results versus.
That's really outside my wheelhouse. I went into science because I absolutely despise politics. And that is because politics is a little bit like religion, in that there's a certain amount of belief and it's not really evidence-based. And for me, everything has to be evidence-based. Is there a bias there? Yes. Are there plenty of companies with a lot of money to lose? Yes. Are they influencing and lobbying government? Yes. Is this like a fair playing field? No. And if you think that's the case, you need to wake up and live in the real world. But aside from that, what can I say about it? You know, I'm not going to kid anybody. I'm no politician, and I'm not even going to pretend like I know any politics or that I follow that stuff. There was someone in Harvard Yard yesterday who was asking Harvard students what the capital of Canada was. And it was embarrassing because most of them actually didn't know. And it turns out that they asked me, and I knew only because I was born and raised there. But even then, I absolutely know nothing about the politics that go on in my own country, let alone the politics that go on in this country. So what I'm saying is stuff that I've heard, but I don't have like a true pulse on, how it's occurring, to what extent. It could all be conspiracy theory as far as I'm concerned, but I don't know. I really, if you had like a more specific question, then.
Sure. I guess so I guess more of a statement is that this, and as scientists possibly in the room, how do we combat that? How do we bring to the forefront the correct data? Because it then gets picked up by the media and therefore spread across the country. How do you stop this cycle of bad, the wrong information out there?
Okay, so I see what you're getting at. As far as publication is concerned, it's actually really difficult, because if you're publishing something that is contradictory to current conventional wisdom or dogma, there's some of the really high impact journals that are not going to accept your publication. Now, you can always publish elsewhere, but it's probably not going to have as high as an impact, and the media is not going to pick up on it. Now, the media is another problem. Let's say that there's this one prospective study that shows that there's an association between red meat and cardiovascular death mortality, but if they factor in sugar consumption or something else, the effect is gone. It would be much more convenient for you to leave that out of the original study, get the big splash, hey, look, red meat's associated with cardiovascular disease, and then publish the sugar stuff on the side. And instead of getting 0 papers, all of a sudden you've got 3. Just saying. So that you're not only fighting the current dogma in the government, but you're actually also fighting the scientists on that one. How do you change that? I guess from the ground up, from what we're trying to do here, and doing these types of presentations and educating people, but it's also going to have to start in the classroom. Like I've yet to see, someone give like an honest presentation of the limitations of certain scientific research or even epidemiology in the classroom, and we have to talk about that. Why do we keep funding this type of research when we know that it is so incredibly limited? And I'm not saying it should never be done, but I'm saying if someone else proposes another red meat and mortality study, the NIH should not fund this at this point, right? Because we have established nothing good's going to come out of it. Absolutely nothing. And that's another problem that needs to address. Where are our funding dollars going? Should we go private with some of this stuff? You could take the conversation in many different directions. I don't have an answer at this point, though. I'm the kind of person that likes to lock myself in my room, read papers, and just fume about the stupid stuff that I read, and then go in public and give talks. I'm sorry, I can't give a good answer to that one, but it would be great to discuss. Yes, should we start the discussion? Absolutely, and I'm glad to see that someone like you is in the field, and that's a start. If you think differently, go get your RD, go get a degree in epidemiology and all that kind of stuff, and make a difference and start educating people the right way.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, the reason I'm here is because I'm running a policy workshop for students at Fletcher Policy School the next couple of days. As a former president of a political party, having to work on policies with my shadow cabinet, I got out of politics also because altogether, saying I don't know how to govern well, because the main role of government is to form policies, what you're talking about. And what we discovered accidentally in working on the desertification problem was how to address complexity in the case I gave you, and realized we'd hit the tip of a much bigger iceberg. And I will be doing that over the next couple of days. All politicians are subjected to those pressures, but they're also subjected to you professional advisors and the conflicting stuff as we've talked of. But the problem is deeper than that and simpler than that. The only reason that any lawmaker forms a policy is to address a problem. If you look at everything in this room, space travel, the computers, those are hard systems in system science. If you look at human organizations, nature, everything we deal with in management, you're dealing with complexity. Social complexity, environmental complexity, it's unavoidable. So you cannot make any policy to address a problem without addressing complexity. Okay? Now, every policy of your government today and every government in the world, when they form a policy, if you ask them what is the context, it's the problem. An objective has to have a context. If I say I'm going to light a fire, you don't know if it's wise or not until you ask me why. Otherwise, if I just light a fire, you'll have a loose cannon on the deck. Okay? Now, the context is almost always need, desire, profit, or dealing with a problem, with everything in this room. That was the context when it was made. It's the same with policies. That context is adequate when you're dealing with a hard system that is not complicated. When you're dealing with complex human systems and environmental, that's an inadequate context. So you'll have loose cannons on the deck. And that is why you get the policies that just don't make sense. Does it make sense for America to produce oil, to grow corn, to produce fuel? Does it make sense in Australia for farmers to go to jail for a longer period than selling drugs if they sell you fresh raw milk? No. I could go on and on and on with examples. And it's not because we're stupid. You've got to go right down to that fundamental level of where we're making decisions. And every decision is objective. We had limited tools, and we didn't have a context for our objectives. So we'll be training students on that, thank God, in the next couple of days, if anyone is involved.
Mr. Savory.
I'm looking for the parrot.
I'm curious when, excuse me, when you move grazing animals onto land where there's not anything left to graze, do you initially supplement their diets or?
No.
Go
I'm
ahead.
always asked that question since the TED. In fact, you asked me it earlier. The only time we've ever had to feed the animals is in mine reclamation. We have zero, just sand, mine reclamation. In the worst cases, some of the stuff like you saw, where it's all bare, we've never had to feed animals. The decisions have to be socially, environmentally, and economically right. And we find we cannot get them right that way, feeding the animals, so we've never had to do it. We worked out how to do it just using the simple principle of a sigmoid growth, or biological functions, basically. If I shave one side of my face, not much hair will grow, other side it'll grow. So if we had this room, doesn't matter what the size, a few animals in it, they can live on available leaf fall, twigs, whatever. If I divide the room, I can keep them for half the year there. That lets plants grow here. If I divide it into 4, I can keep them 90 days there. That lets these plants grow for 270 days. I've already concentrated them more. So that's how we took terrible land and trebled the number of animals, just divided the land, planned the grazing, and their hooves immediately started to break up the soil, get plants growing. We had them short periods, so they didn't have time to get hungry, and plants were growing up ahead of them and behind them. No, we've never had to feed animals.
That's a good question over there on the right.
Allan, I'm curious, in the development of holistic management, what role has monitoring of environmental conditions like soil, water, biomass production played, and what needs to happen in the future with monitoring?
Well, the main thing is to get on with managing holistically, forming policies holistically. Literally, I don't think any scientist would argue today that management, and that includes policies, needs to be holistic, embracing all science and sources of knowledge. The moment we can bring that about, it'll be a different world. Now, that's the main thing. The monitoring is an extremely important part of it, because when you manage any situation holistically, be it in the family, on the farm, the company, wherever it is, all right, you can never replicate, because every person is unique, every situation is unique, so we can't replicate. But what we can do is to monitor the results. We can record the results, and that we do, and that a lot of that's needed. I mentioned that we assume wrong so that we can make the management proactive. We've been in adaptive management for thousands of years, where we do something, it proves wrong because of the complexity, and then we adapt. When we're managing holistically, we assume we're wrong, we look for this point at which we'll get the earliest possible indicator so that we can back off, not make that sort of decision ever again, not repeat that, or we can adjust it. So the management becomes very proactive. Now that monitoring is a vital part of it. And then any other monitoring can support it, but the monitoring doesn't drive it. It's driven by the management. And we need to get research supporting management. What's been happening in most of our countries is researchers have been dominating management when they're totally different fields. And we need to get research supporting management in our lives, whether it's health or anything else. I hope I've answered you. You knew the answer anyway. You always get these wise guys that ask you something they know.
If you want to just go right and the next row behind. No, yeah, you. No, yes, you.
Mr. Savory, I wonder what are your thoughts on using the oceans for like shellfish and sea vegetables to sequester carbon, clean the oceans, and provide a sustainable source of food?
Well, with the carbon problem, all right, we're a carbon economy. You're all carbon. Everything runs on carbon. So we've got to have an ambient carbon cycle going all the time, and everything's playing a part, the oceans, the soil, etc. Our problem apparently is the excess carbon, the legacy load. Now, the more that goes into the oceans, it appears that they're acidifying. That's going to lead to, again, all sorts of consequences. So it becomes terribly urgent that we start getting it back into the soils of the world, which is, agriculture is not crop production. It's the production of food and fiber from the world's land and waters. And only roughly 18% of the world's land is under crops. So it's that bigger area of land that we've got to get it back into forests, rangelands, whatever. And there's no way that I know of, and there may be people working on it, that we can artificially or through management force the pace in oceans. All right? And it's concerning there because of the acidifying. But we can begin, as fast as public opinion changes, to change our policies and start addressing it on the land. Now, every year that we delay at the moment, more and more scientists are saying we've got to, it's so desperate, it's so urgent, we've got to go into geoengineering. Well, I mentioned what we tried with geoengineering desertification. Geoengineering, in other words, using technology to try and put something as big as this in nature right, is like playing Russian roulette with all 6 chambers loaded. That's madness. We've got to do it mimicking nature, like I've been talking about, and get it safely back in the soils with no unintended consequences. And inevitably, some will be going into the oceans. More than that, I don't know.
Sorry, I have a question for you about the role of the consumer and also in philanthropy. So I think there's critiques these days about philanthropy and what good is it to just throw money at a problem, and people need to think more holistically about what they...
I'm battling to hear you.
I'm sorry. I'm asking twofold questions about the role of consumer. So if you don't have ranch land or you don't have access to do something like this yourself, what's the role of consumer? And attached to that idea of what the role of the consumer is your attitudes towards philanthropy, because there's been a critique of it that it's not just enough to throw problems, especially concerning Africa, throw money at these problems.
That's a difficult one. To address this, it needs a societal change of view. If you look at the research of Ashby, Lord Eric Ashby, looking at Britain and America and how new knowledge comes into society, if you read the Everett Rogers, who wrote The Diffusion of Innovations, any of these people, Saul's work, we have a tremendous problem. There are in soft systems, which is human organizations, what are called wicked problems in system science. That means they're almost impossible to solve. Okay, now, one of the wicked problems of human organizations is that they are efficient, etc. They're always up to date with the latest in the prevailing technology, prevailing societal view. So visit any university, ranching organization, company, they'll have the latest computers, the latest software, the latest everything. But if you have new knowledge that is paradigm shifting, counterintuitive, it's combining all that I can read, study, and so on, it is simply impossible for organizations to accept it, to change institutionally until public opinion reaches a certain tipping point, then they can change. Even the leaders of them cannot change them. So it's no good blaming your politicians for unsound policies. They cannot do anything else at the moment. Until public opinion changes sufficiently, then they can change. And you can take that of our universities or anything else. What I talked about here, one part of it was overgrazing of plants. The belief of society is that it's too many animals. That belief has become scientifically valid in our universities and ranching organizations, although backed by no science at all. All right? Now, we discovered, a Frenchman discovered 60 years ago, as I mentioned, that that's not true. It's unrefuted stuff, it's solid science. Can you name a single farming organization, ranching organization, university, government in the world that's accepted it yet? None. That's 60-year-old scientific information, but it's counter to the prevailing view in society. And what I'm talking to you about now, the need to manage policy, form policies holistically, 30 years ago, I put 2,000 scientists from this country through training on the part of your government. They brought their own policies to the training, a week of training on how to address complexity in policies. They could not find a single policy in the United States that would work. All would lead to unintended consequences. All were dealing with symptoms. They made a statement that I recorded verbatim that's in the textbook, and they said, we now recognize that unsound resource management is universal in the United States. That was 30 years ago. Not a single institution has changed yet, because public opinion wasn't aware. Now the philanthropic money, it follows the same course, because that goes into environmental organizations, development organizations, a lot of it, and they put in development projects. They're exactly the same as policies. You don't do any development project unless you're addressing a problem. The context is too simple. I'm living with the other end of it in Africa, and it's a hard thing to say because America is one of the most generous countries, but aid is doing more harm than good. It's destroying people's pride, their dignity. We're having a terrible battle, the other end, as the recipients of aid. Now, we humanely need to do it, etc., but we desperately need all development policies and projects to be holistically developed. Desperately need it. Again, it won't happen until public opinion changes.
Could you talk a little bit about what it would look like to move from an industrialized farming model like we have in the United States into the model that you're proposing?
Can I comment on what?
Can you talk a little bit about what it would look like to move from the current agricultural model we have in the United States to a more sustainable model like you're talking about?
It would be wonderful. Let me just tell you, it would be wonderful, and I'm not joking. A few months ago, had the opportunity to run a policy workshop for 35 lawmakers in my own country. They came from 2 opposing parties, and if you think Republicans and Democrats are rough, our guys are killing each other. I mean, we are living with violence. All right. Now, in that hostile situation, our staff said to me, whatever you do, Allan, don't tackle the land and agriculture. It's the most contentious issue in the country. I said, never mind what I'm going to do. With those 35 members of Parliament, I reminded them first of a statement their own president had made in 1980. He said, as president, he said, we do not have a bigger problem than our rising population and our deteriorating land. He said, we politicians do not know what to do. He said, the only thing we can do is take the advice of our professional advisors. But when it goes wrong, we get the blame, which is very true of every politician, frankly. Right? So I reminded them that. I said, now, to develop a policy, you have to have a context. It cannot be the problems, etc. Let's look at land and agriculture. Now, you cannot redistribute land, it's finite. You can only redistribute people. So let's look at the whole thing openly from scratch now, without your professional advisors. And I said, the first thing we need is a holistic context. How do the people of this country want their lives to be tied to their life-supporting environment in a condition that will have to be 500 years from now? So to get beyond these words like sustainable and so on. We clarified that, and the whole atmosphere changed. It just soared above politics. Anybody would look foolish if they'd raised a pressure issue or a political issue. It had taken us to a whole new level. Then I said, now what's the role of government? Is it to tell farmers what to do, or to let their creativity loose? We put a man on the moon within 70 years of learning how to fly because of human creativity. The knowledge is in our universities, in our farms. It's being blocked. So we agreed on that, and we went step by step through what we could do using a holistic framework. And to cut it short, by the end of the workshop, we had the policy the world's dreaming of. We'd be the first country in the world, if it was implemented, producing more food than eroding soil. Our rivers would be flowing again. And things like organic, sustainable, totally redundant. no need for them, because all food would be nutritious, clean, growing on regenerating soil. And we didn't use a single bit of knowledge that isn't available today. It's not our lack of knowledge. When so many thousands, millions of people over so many years have produced that result in agriculture, you've got to understand it's not a thing you can tweak. It wasn't a lack of knowledge. It's a systemic problem. It was that genetically embedded way we make everything happen today towards an objective, limited tools, and every decision is made on past results, research results, expert opinion, you name it. Compromise, fear, cost, profitability. Every decision is made that way. That's where the problem lay. So the day that American citizens insist that policies being developed holistically, you will see a total change in this country. That I believe firmly. Just like after the Wright brothers flew, no barriers were put in the way. We were on the moon in 70 years. We'll do the same. You'll be amazed at the creativity of Americans once you take those barriers out of the way. And the barriers are 100% institutional blockage. There are no barriers from nature, and there are no barriers from individuals, including individuals in the institutions. It's the institutional structure that is blocking it. How many millions of Catholics accepted the world, our world wasn't the center of the universe? Millions did. When did the Catholic Church concede? In my lifetime. That's what I'm talking about. It won't happen until you change public opinion.
My question was for Allan. I was just wondering how the demand for crops grown for biofuels, such as soybean, corn, sorghum, how has this affected holistic grazing in your country?
Well, it's affecting everybody. That's if you look at that policy and you were to look at it in a holistic context, as we should, I bet you anything you like, you'll find it socially, environmentally, and economically unsound. We shouldn't be doing it. Unless we can develop biofuels somehow from algae or something like that. But the growing of crops to produce them doesn't make any sense at all. And already that's having unintended consequences. Millions of acres in Africa, people are being displaced. You're destroying lives and everything to grow crops to produce fuel. It's almost as bad as the Israeli policy I showed you. But it's going to happen until we do it differently.
Mr. Savory, can you please give an example of a stocking rate and rotation scheme that you would promote on some of these landscapes, and describe how that differs from the rotational grazing that might be promoted in this country among modern agriculture?
I missed the first part of that. What was the difference between the planned grazing that I talked of and the rotational? Was that it? Or?
Yeah, could you just give an example of a stocking rate and a rotation scheme that you would promote for some of these landscapes?
Well, I wouldn't promote any rotational grazing. If you read all that I've written and everything, 50 years ago I said rotational grazing will fail. Voisin, the Frenchman, studied it and its shortcomings, so we never rotate. Rotation literally just means that you watch the grazing periods, the periods in the paddock, you keep them short and you move the animals from here to there, and it can be flexible, it can be anything you like, but the focus is on the grazing periods and the animals. Okay? When we plan grazing, first we go through the decision making to see if animals should be there at all. Some places they shouldn't be, like tropical forests, which are being cleared for animals. They shouldn't be there at all. Other places you see that they're essential. Nothing else will do the job and sustain people. Then when we've decided that, the land is divided up. I'm giving you a very Reader's Digest version, but once we start the planning, the first thing we do before plotting the moves is to establish what period of recovery the plants need. Okay? Then we plan backwards from that to what periods of grazing to use, adjust them for quality of land, etc., and plot those moves. But it has to be on a chart, because think of it yourself. If we had 10 divisions of land and we're moving the animals through them 5 days on a rotation, all right? If in the first one, after 3 days, we're worried, we move them out. After the second one, after 2 days, there's not enough grass or it's not growing quickly enough, so we move them out. And we go like this. What we don't see is the concertina effect on the recovery period. Every time you change a grazing period by 1 day, you've changed the recovery period of all of it. And so what happens is people end up coming back and plants haven't recovered. It's just such a common problem. So we always focus on the recovery period, and having it on a chart, you see it. If whatever happens to it, you see it, and it avoids that. That's the main point. But there are other things. When you rotate, you can only go forwards. You can go from here to there, here to there. When you plan grazing and you're doing it over a time spell on a chart, you can go backwards. And if you think about when we make a big building or something, in PERT programming, we plan it backwards from a date of completion because it's much more efficient planning. So if we've got a chart here and we can see that animals are lactating, they'll have calves at foot, and we need good grazing for them in November or whenever it is, we book the grazing. And then we say, how did they get there? Oh, they came from here. Well, how did they get there? Well, they came from here. You see, and we can plan it backwards. So we'll often plan critical periods backwards and then come to where we are and say, well, now how do we get them there? So it's planned movement of animals, not rotational. And I don't know what it is about this country, but training ranchers, I've often had them say, oh, I'm going to be doing this, and this, should the animals move clockwise or anti-clockwise? And I've put on a serious look and said, well, we're in the northern hemisphere. Yeah, it's got to be clockwise. And you see them writing it down. And funny enough, if you look at rotational grazing, it nearly always is clockwise. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I'm curious about job creation in some of your examples.
Job creation is critical. Let me go back to the agricultural policy I was talking of just now. What we did in testing the ideas and getting them, and then we filter them to see that they're socially, the sort of ideas come up. I'm not recommending it for you. Never take something from one and put it into another. But we determined there that the wisest thing was to say, okay, all the people that are farming in agriculture get a license. You have a license to farm. Now let's remove all income tax from farming. So if you are farming, you never pay income tax. That now, because we're starting to reward what we want that is in context and make difficult what isn't. Okay, so that induces everybody now to start producing, because we're being fed by the world. We used to be an exporting country. Now, if you've got that happening, then the second thing we said is, right now, let's put a fixed land tax. So if you have a license to farm, you pay a fixed land tax every year. Now you have a fixed cost and no income tax, so you're going to push production even higher because your profitability will be greater. And then we said, no, we've got over 80% unemployment. And we said, right now, if you're farming, for every family living and working on that land, your land tax is reduced. What's going to happen? People are now going to start employing people instead of machines, get people back on the land. And it just went through with things like that. I could go on and on. There's a case I might well use in the next couple of days. The big community near me, 150,000 people on food aid, out of work. The government policy has just graded 100 kilometers of road. That cost $500,000 or whatever it is. All right, everybody would do that. What was the context? The road is bad. Do you see it? That's too simple a context for anything in management. So when we filtered that to see if it was in context, it failed all of the questions we asked. Then we said, how else could we do it? And it turned out, do it by hand. And lo and behold, that would get that money back in that community. People could start paying school fees again, get people working again, keep the money cycling in the community again. Whereas if we graded, it's all going 300 miles south to where a company has the grader. It's going right out of the community. So it's just little things like that, even grading a road. It's not about livestock only. That's the thing we've got to focus on, because that's where we're hemorrhaging and the desertification. But as I said to you, we hit the tip of a much bigger iceberg in finding out how to deal with that complexity. Much bigger iceberg. I know I'll have fun with students, I hope, the next couple of days doing this. And they'll just start by doing it.
So I think we're just about out of time, but for everyone who's continuing on to the dinner, you can continue the
But you
conversation
got little
there.
flight.
But we'd like to thank both of our speakers, Allan Savory and Matt Allan.
Thank you. Thank you.